Date first, pay second. All right, if I don't get things started, I'm going to cause us to miss our collective future. So, are you ready? Are you guys ready? Yes, are you ready? Okay, are you future ready? Well, I do hope that you're future ready because we are absolutely thrilled to have with us our keynote speaker here today from his home in Seattle, Richard Yonk. Richard Yonk is a futurist, an author, and a speaker with a background in computer science and media studies. He helps clients and audiences identify future opportunities and challenges with a focus on leveraging that knowledge for future success. He's been published by and quoted in the New York Times, Scientific American, the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, Wired, World Future Review, BBC News, and many others. In the area of the future, he's a player. He's also a former executive board member of the Association of Professional Futurists. He's a member of the National Association of Science Writers, a TEDx speaker, and I don't know where he gets the time, but he's also the author of 2 best-selling books on the future of human and artificial intelligence, called Heart of the Machine and Future Minds. We're thrilled he's with us today. Please join me in giving a warm aloha to Richard Yonk.
Thank you so much. When I was a young boy, I often journeyed into deep space, searching out the new stars and planets to explore. Many years before the first astronauts set foot on the moon, I would lift off from my bedroom at the north end of Seattle after the rest of my family had gone to sleep. Long before Microsoft, Amazon, and Starbucks, this was the Seattle of timber, of fishing vessels, and one lone corporate giant, Boeing. The space age was just getting started, and more than anything, I wanted to be an astronaut. So I worked hard, I studied the sciences and many other subjects, all the while continuing to build my imaginary spaceships and computers. I would journey into space and sometimes go into the past to witness the beginnings of the Big Bang. Other times I might leap ahead to see the first colonies that we'll establish on other worlds. It was amazing. Many people say that the speed of light is the fastest thing in the universe. I think it might be the speed of thought. But as you may have surmised, I made a number of choices and decisions, and that little boy didn't become an astronaut. But I did remain absolutely fascinated with this notion of mental time travel. The idea that we're able to project ourselves into the past and into the future in order to build a better world, build a better future, that's amazing. It's like a superpower, a power that each and every one of us has. It's a trait that may have been responsible for bootstrapping us to become the species we are today. Just imagine 4 million years in that little amount of time, we have been transformed from a relatively unexceptional primate into the globe-spanning technological species we are today. 4 million years. That's nothing relative to the life of the Earth or the cosmos. So just imagine, what might we achieve in another million years, or another 1,000, or another century? What could we do in the next few decades, the next few years? Imagine what we could do tomorrow. Aloha. I'm futurist Richard Yonk, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today for the Hawaiian Business Leadership Conference 2022. We're going to be talking today about the future, what it is, how it works, and some of the ways that it can help us build resilience as well as perhaps a few things about how it's going to transform our world over the course of the next couple of decades. Whenever I visit anywhere, speak anywhere, I always remind myself that I want to learn from all of you about your businesses, your community, your culture, because you're the experts in all of this. What I hope to have to offer is a little bit of insight about the future and how it works so that it can excite and inspire you and give you some opportunity to reflect on it over the course of this conference and hopefully the years and beyond that. So, as I said, this is a fairly natural trait that we have, the ability to anticipate what comes next. It's something we've done naturally throughout all of our existence, but it can only take us so far. So futures and foresight work really began in about the middle of the last century. And right after the turn of the Cold War, we had a really difficult situation. The world was on a knife's edge. People were concerned about nuclear holocaust. We were moving into the Cold War. The space age was going to start off before too very long. And leaders in government, in the military, really wanted to know what comes next, or what can we do to avoid catastrophe. They also were dealing with a lot of new systems, a lot of new projects that were expensive, often took a long lead time to develop, things like new fighter jets and so forth. So they wanted to understand what were going to be the conditions in the environment in the coming, by the time that project was actually complete. Would it be obsolete? What would it be dealing with at that time? What was going to be the infrastructure? Could it support it? And so forth. So they started a few projects, including one called the RAND project that quickly became the RAND Corporation. Now, the RAND Corporation was one of our earliest think tanks, and there they developed some of the early futures and foresight methodologies for trying to anticipate and understand what comes next. Not just tomorrow, but perhaps a year or a decade or more from now. Now, that was successful enough that work began to permeate different businesses, started to be used by multinationals all over the world. You have companies that have inside futurists like Intel. You have companies that hire consultants and so forth. We also have university degree programs in the field. You even have one here at your own University of Hawaii at Manoa. And we see futures work being used in design, in trends analysis, architecture, and all kinds of other fields. So that said, I'm going to let you in on a dirty little secret. The future doesn't exist. That's right. Think about it. The present, we know what that is. It's all of this. It's the here and now. We can touch it, taste it, feel it. It's real for us. And the past, well, we sort of understand that because it used to be our future. It used to be our present. But the future is something else entirely. There's nothing predestined about the future. It's not a set of events waiting to unfurl on a timeline or anything like that. The future is potential. It's the potential for all of us, for ourselves, for our families, for our businesses, for our world. And what we do with that potential is what's really important about using this superpower of ours. So because of this, when futurists talk about the future, we usually talk about futures plural. Not one future or the future. We talk about the possible, the plausible, the preferred futures, the futures we want to work toward. And in doing so, this sort of begins the framework for how we explore this, realizing that we can't predict what's going to happen. We've seen that often enough in these past number of years. What we can do is figure out, okay, what are the things that can happen? What are the possible directions we could go? What are the scenarios? And prepare for a number of those so that we have them in our back pocket when, if certain things develop. So that's the general kind of concept within futures work, but ultimately it's about creating a better world, creating a future that is suitable and serves all of us, that is ideally that preferred future, the future that we all deserve. So right now we are dealing with a range of challenges. We've talked about briefly that we've just dealt with or been going through the pandemic, but there's certainly many more things. We're dealing with climate change, we're dealing with many different types of social discord, forms of discord and so forth. So how do we avoid this? How can we build out a world that changes how it approaches moving into the world we're going to be living in? Well, part of this, I believe, is a lot to do with taking on a long-term mindset, which futures work tends to really embrace. The fact is that when we are living our regular lives, our normal everyday lives, we tend to focus on the immediate. We tend to focus on the next quarter in our businesses and so forth. And the short-term thinking tends to get us into trouble because it doesn't adequately weigh up all of the necessary costs that can occur over the course of any decision. The other thing that really has to change, I believe, is our, what I call our chronocentric mindset. Everybody who has ever lived tends to believe that the time they are living in, that era, is the most important of all of history. It's only a natural bias. But the fact is, everybody in the Middle Ages thought this, everybody at different periods in the future is going to think this, and it tends to lead to beliefs that, these are going to be the end times and so forth. We have had that so many times over the course of the years. We always get through it. We find solutions. That's the wonderful thing about this cognition of ours, that we are able to actually exceed our ability to adapt through evolution. We're able to make change, to be able to build a world based on what our needs and desires are, and our needs and desires need to become more long-spanning, long-term thinking. So we'll talk about a little bit about that in a minute, but the idea that we can take on new mental models, new ways of approaching these things like creating a circular economy wherein we reincorporate the services, the resources, the energy, so that we aren't being so wasteful. We are able to continue with less while still creating a world that serves everybody, because we're going to continue to have increased population, and I believe, I'm not the only one, demographically we're going to see about 1 billion more people enter the global middle class over the course of the next decade. That's going to lead to an enormous amount of consumption of new energy needs and demands, and the answer isn't to simply say, oh, you guys can't do that. We have to create new technologies, new approaches, new mindsets to deal with this changing world. One of the things that we're definitely making good headway with is renewable energy. This is early days still. It seems like we've been doing this for decades. We have, but we're going to be developing so many new forms of energy over the course of the next number of decades, also continuing to make the ones we're working with, more and more efficient. So as we go through these next decades, these next years, how do we take on how do we change our mindset? How do we begin to be better stewards of the future? How can we be the good ancestors we need to be? Well, what I believe we have to do is we have to stop thinking that we own the present. We don't own this moment in time any more than anyone else has. We were entrusted with this moment by everyone who came before us. Everything created that is human created, the technologies, the culture, the language, all of it has been handed down to us by those who came before. Similarly, we have an absolute duty to pass along the best possible world to those who come after us. Our children, of course, but really we owe it to all of the descendants who will come after us in the centuries beyond. One example I like to think about and refer to is one that comes to us from one of the pandemics, not this most recent one, but one from the early in the last century. There we go. And that was when the polio epidemic was really taking hold in the world. This was devastating. It caused a lot of grief, a lot of pain. Many people died, many people were paralyzed by it. I grew up with some children who had suffered this and had their legs paralyzed. This is a devastating disease. So Jonas Salk spent 7 years working on a vaccine. By the time it was ready, he decided not to patent it, not to profit by it, in order to get it out into the world as quickly as possible. In the course of 1 decade, it had all but been eradicated throughout the US. The case numbers dropped precipitously. And over the coming decades beyond that, it continued to have that same impact across the world. So one of the things Salk was quoted as saying is, our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors. And I think that really captures what we need to perceive ourselves as we go forward. Recently, this past year, a very good book about the good ancestor by Roman Krnazik was written. It's a great way to have some of this conversation, to explore some of the concepts behind this long-termism, this idea of how we are going to create a better future, be better ancestors, be better stewards of the future. So when I look out at this, there are many trends that are driving some of our problems, many trends that are going to help us solve them. One of these is the issues around lack of diversity in the tech industry. We need to be able to, in all aspects of our world, have more input from more diverse voices, have everyone as represented as possible, because this is how we build a fair and equitable future, and that's going to likely lead to the best, most preferred, the best and most preferred future for us all. One of the things about futures work is that when we do it, part of the work involves challenging our prior assumptions, because we're trying to make a projection based on where the world is now and where it's going to go. Having a diversity of input, a diversity of voices and perspectives is essential to that work, because when you don't have it, your view becomes very, very myopic. You end up making choices about a technology, about a policy that isn't properly representative of what the world needs. So that's essential to how we continue to go forward from here. As we've seen, this kinds of not having that diversity has led to problems in AI, problems in social media platforms, where various forms of toxicity, various forms of racism and other issues are perpetuated throughout society, throughout our literature, throughout our social media. That has to be definitely curbed because it's perpetuating a lot of unnecessary discord at a time when we really need to come together. When we talk about the problems in not having a broad enough view when creating a technology, a very simple example I like to give is a soap dispenser that was developed for touchless dispensing. The designers kudos to them. It was a great idea. We wanted to try and have better hygiene in the world. The problem was that the sensor was designed to activate for a light-skinned hand. So we put a dark-skinned hand under it, and it did not work. That's a big design flaw, and something that really should have been caught very, very easily and early on. Other trends and issues that we face. Global energy consumption is going to continue to increase. We talk about trying to reduce our energy consumption. This is important. We have to do this up to a point, but the overall trends going all the way back through all of our history and actually the history of the universe shows that we are on a path of continuing escalating energy consumption, need for what's known as energy rate density, that is inevitably going to lead to more and more energy consumption on the planet. What we have to do, therefore, we can't just simply say we're going to unplug a bunch of our devices. We actually have to make that energy cleaner, make it less contributing to the global heating that goes on in the world, and actually create a world that ultimately gets away from fossil fuel. For a long time, we're going to need at least a little bit of it. We need that energy density, but unfortunately, we really have to move forward with this. And we have, and we will continue to do so. Pollution, obviously, is a huge issue as well. We have problems with that are moving into a global scale, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, other types of pollution problems. Just imagine another billion people who are consuming that much more. That's going to only exacerbate the problem. So we have to create ways of moving past that. Global heating, the climate change that's coming from that, we're in definitely a point where we're all starting to know that this is very, very real and is going to be an ongoing problem throughout the century. We have to batten down the hatches and begin to really make inroads going forward. So those are the problems. What are the solutions? What are the ways we're going to get past this? Certainly, we are starting to make huge inroads with energy. Solar power has dropped precipitously in terms of its installation costs, its production costs. This is something that is basically known as because of Wright's law. You've all heard about Moore's law, but Wright's law is essentially a superset of that. It's the same idea, but it applies to so many other areas. Wright's law essentially says that the more that we do something, the more we learn about it, the more times we build it, change it, adapt it, we get better and better at it. This is what's basically happened with Moore's law. It's this continual iterative cycle of developing transistors that get smaller and smaller. They create more and more powerful computers. They use less energy. The costs go down. And the same thing happens in many other types of manufacturing cycles over time. One really pertinent example, I think, with regard to solar costs, this is from a colleague and friend, Ramez Nam, who's been doing research in this field for many years. The predictions of where the costs were going to be for solar have been quite dramatic over the years, but as we can see, if you look at the left-hand side of that graph, all of that is the actuals. We have actually already far exceeded all of these longer-term projections, and that's only going to continue for a good few decades. Electric vehicles are reaching an inflection point. We're reaching a point where that technology is now so affordable, so efficient, that consumers are at the point where they're ready to start buying it in mass. We're going to see that really over this coming decade make the major transformation, major transition. We've heard some executives in the past few weeks in the auto industry talk about 2040, but it's going to be much earlier than that because we're already on this elbow of this upward exponential curve. Green hydrogen, we're making good headway in that, and that's also going to continue to create some higher energy density options. So, what are some other areas and fields that are really going to be affecting this future, and the one I write about and talk about the most is AI. We have had AI for years. We've had it for decades. People keep asking, when are we going to have this or that AI? There is so much AI permeating all aspects of our world already, but it's only going to become vastly more so in the next couple of decades. We're entering into what is being termed by some as the third wave of AI. Now, that is a new model that is moving past the neural networks that we use today to recognize images, to be able to recognize voices and so forth, to actually allow these systems to have something closer to the cognitive abilities that human beings do. This is not to say we're talking about machines that can think exactly like us and overthrow us and all of this. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about tools that are going to be able to perform many of the tasks that are mundane for us, but still require a certain amount of cognitive load, a certain amount of human thinking currently. They will become smarter by being able to learn much more like we do, like a child learns, from what's known as single shot or zero shot learning, showing them a few examples rather than 100 million examples to be able, so they can learn what a giraffe or a cat looks like, being able to build upon prior knowledge, be able to understand common sense, be able to infer, and so forth. This is actually coming over the course of the next couple of decades, and these technologies are going to change and infuse into all of these other technologies we have, the digital assistants, our automobiles most certainly. That is going to be part of how we're going to get over this last little hump for being able to have fully autonomous vehicles and so forth. So one thing that happens with technology trends is that they tend to develop at a particular expected pace. But every once in a while, what happens is you have an event. Something occurs, whether it's a war, whether it is a pandemic, and it ends up accelerating a number of those technologies. So we have, in the past few years, we've seen an acceleration in the development of drone technology, telemedicine, biotechnology, autonomous vehicles, robotics, and so forth. And this is something that I think is worth mentioning because we're in a crisis right now. The climate crisis is something that really needs us to get serious about. And being able to recognize that when we actually make things a priority, we can achieve some pretty amazing things. Ultimately, I do believe that it's not that we're going to simply regulate or achieve this through political means. We're actually in a period when we're dealing with a lot of political paralysis and so forth. But if we can make a number of these things available and approach it from an economic standpoint, if you make things affordable for people, if it makes the most economic sense to do certain things, that's when you get people to adopt it very, very easily and fluidly. So I do believe that's going to be part of how we'll get past this current period. Drone technology, we thought of it as just pretty much a toy early on, but it's obviously become more and more prevalent. We're seeing it start to be used for vehicles, for delivery, and so forth. In Sweden recently, they developed had a project where they delivered defibrillator to a person who actually was having a heart attack in an emergency situation. It got the defibrillator to them quickly, and they saved the person. It was actually, I believe, a doctor who had suffered a heart attack. That's phenomenal. And if you think about incorporating AI with that, the sensors in our environment and so forth, we could be saving some lives very, very, making some significant difference there. Different forms of telemedicine, telerobotic surgery, and so forth are going to become more and more prevalent. I anticipate that being incorporated with things like medical tourism and so forth, so that we end up being able to have access to all of the best medicine and surgeons anywhere in the world. That is a pretty significant opportunity, I think, both from a business standpoint, but certainly in terms of healthcare. And speaking of healthcare, during the next 2 decades, we're moving into a period of increasing digital personalized medicine, where we'll have an opportunity to have a continuous flow of information from ourselves securely to medical platforms that can gauge if we're having some type of imbalance, be able to detect early disease, early cancers and so forth. We know that this is how we have the best outcomes. When the earlier that we can detect a problem, the better. In terms of resilience, that's really going to be something that we have to anticipate a lot of different possible changes during this period of climate change. Obviously, on your beautiful islands, you have a lot of moisture, a lot of growth, but that is assuming that all of the weather patterns stay the way they are. Over time, in different parts of the world, we're going to be using more technologies like vertical farming that is incredibly, at least in the early development stages, very, very water efficient, is able to use various forms of data gathering to increase crop yields and so forth, using various other forms of agri-tech and robotics. We'll be able to make these processes more and more efficient, more and more cost effective. When it comes to being in one of the more remote parts of the world, your islands are still going to be in need of transport for getting goods here, getting food and otherwise. Right now, that remains something very, very energy intensive in terms of fossil fuels, but there are technologies such as this eco-ship that is being developed with the idea that it is, I believe, about 1/3 the amount of energy consumption that is used by a same size container ship. So here again, we're figuring out ways to use technology to help deal with some of the different challenges that we have. Here on your big island, you have Mackay, one of the, I believe, largest OTEC technologies, ocean thermal energy conversion, which essentially draws cold water from the depths, circulates it, and generates energy that way. I think that's an awesome way to use energy differentials to be able to create very, very clean energy. And of course, we have so much energy in the form of the oceans to be able to use wave action, tidal action, and so forth in developing new ways to do that. So, with that, I just want to make a few points. There's a lot of technology in there. There's a lot of concerns about the future. How do we change our own mindsets, our own selves to be able to create a better future for our families and everyone who comes after? Well, I believe we're going to be having to continually remind ourselves of what's important. We have to remember that our home, our planet, that's critical in order that we can all continue to live and survive. We have to retain and protect our cultures in order that this continues to have meaning to all of us. We have to continue to protect and consider the future of the people in our world, our families, and of course the many generations to come. So, with that, I hope that gives all of you some inspiration, some ideas to think about through the course of this conference, some things to consider in the coming days and hopefully years beyond that, and that for all of you, that you'll continue to look to the stars as you build the future that we all deserve, and prefer. Mahalo.